This is Bonjour Chai, the Lucky Jews edition. I'm Avi Feingold, and I'm here with Phoebe Maltzbovy. We are your Frozen Chosen. On today's show, we talk to writer Tanya Gold about her experience with Holocaust tourism. We discuss the pager attack in Lebanon, and we also get into the scandal unfolding on the Jewish Chronicle in England. All this and more coming right up.
Hello, we are so excited to welcome Tanya Gold on to the program today. She's a freelance writer who has written for every major publication ever, among them the New York Times, The Spectator, The New Statesman, and Unheard. I also need to say, though, that she's on specifically to talk about a really just epic piece of journalism that we all read and cannot get over how really just impressive and fascinating it was, for Harper's Magazine. And it's the Harper's Magazine Letter from Poland. I don't know how people vacation in Poland generally, but this is about a certain special type of vacation. The title is My Auschwitz Vacation, the subtitle on Holocaust tourism. And it reads like travel journalism, except with a twist. But first, but we're going to talk about it a lot. First, I want to welcome Tanya to the show. Hello.
Thank you. Hi, it's lovely to be here.
So what prompted the trip and when?
It's absolutely clear to me what prompted it. I'm a British Jew. I will explain a bit more about the sort of emotional hinterland of the British Jew later, because in my experience, diaspora communities tend to reflect the cultures in which they live. And I lived in total security, maybe not emotional security, but I knew that I was one of the lucky Jews. We'll come to the Polish lucky Jew later. The British Jewish community is notoriously the luckiest Jewish community in Europe. We are the only community that survived the Shoah without any loss. We had no losses at all, while, of course, in continental Europe, all those communities were to some or a greater extent, mostly, of course, in Poland, decimated. And we are loyal subjects of the Queen on the whole. I mean the King. It's so difficult to remember Elizabeth II is dead. Our synagogues look like churches. There are Jews in the House of Lords. And yet when Jeremy Corbyn, and I understand that this is a subjective opinion, I believe that when Jeremy Corbyn, the leftist, became leader of our opposition Labour Party in 2016, he opened the floodgates to an anti-Semitism which had been dormant in Britain, certainly for my lifetime and my mother's lifetime. We saw a growing hostility to Jews if they believe that the 7 million Jews who live in Israel have a right to live there within any kind of borders at all, whether you're talking about the 67 borders or the occupied territories or whatever else. If you identified as a Zionist, they hated you, the Corbynites, and it blasted into the mainstream. And I think it really changed me, because until 2016, when I was 45, I had never seen public anti-Semitism in my lifetime, ever. I mean, I'd heard about it. My mother is a historian of the Shoah, so I know quite a lot about the history of the Jews of Europe, but I'd never seen it. And I think that was when I had this desire to delve into my past. Into the past of the Jewish people, in Europe. I wrote once that to be an Anglo-Jew, I sometimes felt like I was impersonating an English person and I was impersonating a Jew. And I was doing both of them quite badly. And my grandmother was from Poland. Her family were from Poland. She was the only one of her sisters who was born here. They were from Łódź, which is about 150 miles from Auschwitz. And because my mother is so learned on the history of the Jews of Europe and was one of the people who helped to set up anti-racist education in Poland, as far back as the 80s, she used to go around those little towns where there are no Jews. And there was once an amazing experience when a man came up to her and her group. The men were wearing kippas, and her colleague spoke Yiddish because his family were also Polish Jews. This man came up, and it wasn't exactly landsman, but he explained that he was the only surviving Jew of his village. He had married the girl of the family who had hidden him, and would they go to his apartment and say Kaddish for the family. So I grew up, and I said this in the Harper's piece, feeling the real Jewish world isn't here. And I've got to explain, this piece is not just travel, it's memoir. I write only from my own point of view. But I had always believed in a sort of tragic way that Jewish Poland was more authentically Jewish. My grandmother's Poland that she never saw was more authentically Jewish than the Jewish life I had in England. So I felt a great hunger to go back there. Another thing that prompted me was I was mildly obsessed with the 1-star reviews on TripAdvisor of the Auschwitz Museum. I found them funny. And I was also very interested in, as anti-Semitism rose, in my view, throughout Europe, we seem to have yet more and more Holocaust memorials. They're planning a big Holocaust memorial in London right next to the Houses of Parliament. It's people fight over this. I mean, I myself think it's a really bad idea, and listeners will probably understand why at the end of this talk. And I thought, what is the connection between this plethora of Holocaust memorials and rising anti-Semitism? And then there was TripAdvisor, and then there was my grandmother. So I thought I would go to Poland and find out for myself.
I was just thinking about the sort of the longing for the old country, which I think exists. There's a kind of anti-Zionist version of it that involves kind of romanticizing the Eastern European Jewish experience prior to the Holocaust. But there's also just, I mean, my own family is also very much from that part of the world. And something that I've been thinking of a lot is just kind of the tendency, at least in North America, of Jews to say that their ancestors are Polish. You know what I mean? And Bernie Sanders famously was talking about his Polish heritage. And this is something I've always wondered about. And I live in Toronto's Polish neighborhood. And by coincidence, we were talking, I spent Saturday at the Polish Festival. That's just like the big street fair where I live. And my friend was saying something about how one of her grandparents was Polish. And I was asking her, like, would he have thought of himself as Polish, or would other people have? And she was like, yeah, that's a good point. And well, first of all, do British Jews talk about their ancestors as having been Polish, or do they say Jewish? And also whether you see that sort of linguistic choice as having any significance.
I mean, I would describe myself as Polish Jewish ancestry. Because you're right, you know, and when I was in Poland, I found myself, and when I was writing the article, I found myself saying, you know, Poles and Jews, you know, forgetting the categorization, Polish Jews. And I feel I don't have anything very profound to say on this. And what I sort of want to say is, you know, I wish we could go back and we could ask the Jewish residents of Oswiecim, the town next to Auschwitz, you know, do you feel Polish? Do you feel Polish or do you feel Jewish? So the answer to your question is, I mean, I just don't know. And I suppose that one of the reasons I wanted to write this piece is I wanted to have a settled idea of myself as a British Jew. And I think you can look back too much. And one of the things I've believed since October the 7th, because as I said, we were such a settled community, we were haunted, sure, but so lucky that the rise in anti-Semitism and the hatred has been so shocking. I almost feel like every Jew I know has gone crazy with the trauma that you've left behind. So maybe there's a sense that I don't want to live in the Poland of my imagination. I understand that everybody does this. I spoke to a wonderful guide in the Krakow ghetto, and I want to talk to you about Krakow before we start talking about Auschwitz and Oswiecim. And he said everybody does that. You know, everybody brings their own interpretation because of the loss, and also because of the culture that people make about it. People find it hard to believe it's real, and they obsess about it, and they project onto it. But as regards the Polish Jewish question, my guess is, you know, like the answer to the question, you know, I'll find a rabbi who'll say that they're Polish, and I'll find a rabbi who'll say they're Jewish.
Oh, fair enough. I just know that when I'm walking around the neighborhood, I just, ever since moving to this neighborhood in 2020, I keep thinking, like, I know my family's from the same geographical area as the people whose neighborhood this was, whatever, you know. But I never feel Polish even a little bit.
Well, that's what violence was, isn't it? You know, it divides people. And if you're going to divide a country like Poland up between the Nazis on the one hand and, you know, Stalin the monster on the other, you know, no good will come of it. You know, people who live together in peace will will turn on each other and will hate. I mean, I experienced it as a place of tragedy, and of course not just for Jewish people.
Mm-hmm. Where you talk about the fact that Poles essentially, like for a long time, really escaped the scrutiny, and that they really sort of flew under the radar, and now it's sort of moving back in the other direction. And what we read about with in the article is the effects of what happens when people start to pay attention to the fact that, hey, there was a lot of Poles that were actually not wonderful during the Holocaust. There were definitely ones that saved, but they were not, and there's a lot of shame and there's a lot of blame, right, that is going on around here, and the desire to like run away from the blame really is out of a sense of shame. And I'm curious, if any of this is resonating in terms of like the people that you're meeting had any sort of sense of what was going on with this.
Well, as you know, Poland had for many years until last year, when thankfully they were elected out, the very right-wing Law and Justice Party, very nationalistic, and they pursued a policy of Polish martyrdom and Polish heroism. And there was an awful lot of diminishing of the Holocaust. They had these ridiculous and unseemly campaigns where there would be a billboard at a station that said the Poles were first in Auschwitz, which, by the way, is absolutely true. And they tried to remake Poland as a country of rescuers. Everybody saved the Jews. And unfortunately, that just simply isn't true. What astonished me most, particularly when I went to the town of Oswiecim, which is the town next to Auschwitz, which I was absolutely fascinated by, was the absolute emptiness, the sense of emptiness, because this was a town that was 50% Jewish in 1940, and now there are no Jews in the town. But if there are no Jews, there are no Roma, there are no Sinti, clerics, dissidents. If the Nazis didn't kill them, then Stalin did. You know what happened in the Warsaw Uprising when the non-Jewish Poles managed to take part of Warsaw back. Stalin waited across the river. First of all, there was the trauma of the war, and then after that, there were, how many years of Stalinism and until 1990? Is that nobody here is over anything.
The images that you were talking about, this banal visits to Auschwitz almost, right? It's almost as if Auschwitz has become, like we have 30 minutes in the Uffizi, we're on our grand tour, we have to get back to whatever. It's just another station that you have to go visit on whatever it is that you're visiting. And what struck me was that how do we, debanalify it? How do we think about it in this way? And is there, I'm not going to say is there responsibility, but there's got to be a relationship between the way in which Jews went to Auschwitz almost religiously starting in the 90s, with the March of the Living, and this desire to heal, right? Was we got to go to Auschwitz because we got to heal, because we believe in this never again, never forget, never again, never forget. And I feel like there's a direct correlation between that and the way in which now it's become just this yet another tourist destination. I don't know if that struck you, if you've thought about that when you were there or in the writing.
I've never been on a March of the Living. I don't like those kind of things. But I also say that any Jew or any Roma or any ancestor or relation to a victim who wants to go there should and can go there for any reason that they want. For me, it's just a graveyard. And it's not an honorable graveyard. It's a Nazi graveyard. Maybe you'll want to talk about this, my sort of emotional responses to Birkenau. I was so disgusted after my tour. I basically just wanted to lock it and let the trees and let the grass grow on it. But I think Auschwitz has become a thing. Howard Jacobson, who is absolutely my favorite contemporary Jewish writer, I was on a panel with him after October the 7th, and he said, I feel like a fictional creature. I feel like a fictional being. The Jew is a fictional being. I'm paraphrasing him. And I think we've seen that throughout our history in Europe. We were the well poisoners. We are, on the one hand, if you talk about all the negative Jewish stereotypes, we are, on the one hand, we are like rats, but on the other hand, we are like demons. And I feel that Auschwitz has become similarly a very sort of fictional place. There's much too much culture. There's much too much trash culture about Auschwitz. And some of the really good culture doesn't work either. I mean, I was astonished to see Auschwitz appear in an X-Men film, and I know that the authors of those magazines were Jewish, but to see it in 2015 as plot device, and of course there's this whole pile of the most sort of shockingly tawdry, de-Judaized books about the Holocaust. My least favorite, of course, is The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. I give that John Boyne. It sold 11 million copies. It's taught in schools, for God's sake, though the Auschwitz Museum says they wish they wouldn't teach it in schools. And although he is a very skilled novelist, which sort of makes me take against him more, there is no Jewish aesthetic in that novel. That is not a novel about Jewish people and what happened to them. So my basic feeling about Auschwitz is, as I said, it's a graveyard, and it needs to be an honored graveyard. And one of the reasons that it isn't is because it's been so detached from the Jewish experience. It seems to me that people know much more about Jewish death than they do about Jewish life. There is an amazing museum of Jewish life in Poland, in Warsaw, called Polin. And the Holocaust, I think, has only one room out of many. And yet people, they go to this graveyard, and as I said, we are things.
Right, well, it's like the Dara Horn, people love dead Jews sort of argument. But I was wondering just in terms of what, and to bring this back to kind of the Canadian angle to this, whether you see any parallel between the function these days of Holocaust memorialization and land acknowledgements.
Land acknowledgements. I'm sorry, I didn't know.
A land acknowledgement, the beginning of basically any kind of meeting or anything like that. There's a moment where the person leading the meeting will talk about all of the indigenous groups that had traditionally been in that land. It's just, it has to happen, basically, even though there's been pushback saying that it's kind of an empty gesture.
I'd never heard of that.
I used to see it at theater performances. They would start the performance. Before they would start, they would say, that we are on the traditional land of these people, and this is unceded. And it's gotten very complicated because everybody kind of is aware that it's a way to sort of virtue signal and pat yourself on the back and say, you see, I acknowledge and I recognize that these people were here before me, and we're now, the white colonizers or the descendants of those on this land.
Not just white. It's a land acknowledgement.
Everything.
Any immigrant, including refugees to Canada. Anyway.
And how do the people whose land was stolen feel about these gestures?
Mixed, as I understand it.
Very mixed, yeah.
It's mixed feelings. But something I really want to ask you about while we have you on is just this question of the sort of the go back to Poland line. And I was wondering if UK protests following October 7th have had this line, the line "Go back to Poland," hurled at Jews, because this has happened in Montreal.
I don't think I've heard that. I don't think I've heard
okay.
that. I don't think I've heard that in the UK. Though, of course, you get. I'm not sure sometimes where, as a Jew, I should get out of. Palestine and Europe.
Mm-hmm. No, it's just something that Avi and I both had in our notes for this. We were like, it's like the thing, the go back to Poland thing, because it's
you hear it at protests.
Because I have just wondered when people have what it could possibly mean in Montreal to tell a Jew to go back to Poland. Because at first I thought, okay, this is just some kind of reference to trying to claim that Jews are basically just white colonizers. But then I thought, no, maybe this is like a go kill yourself kind of thing, and that it is in fact a reference to Poland as a graveyard for Jews, effectively.
Well, I'd like to see the fights over the houses.
Right.
I mean, it's just a slur, isn't it? I mean, 99% of the Jews of Poland were murdered. I mean, that seems to me people just it expresses a desire for a Judenrein space, doesn't it? For a space without Jews. Though sometimes they will call them, Zionists, but I think less and less, and I think we will see less and less of that in the coming years. And I'm looking forward to that, because I think the gaslighting is probably the most irritating part for me. But no one's told me to go back to Poland. I suppose I'm indigenous to Norbiton, which is a sort of dismal suburb of southwest London.
I'm curious what you think should happen with Auschwitz, meaning if you were in control, what do we have a museum there? Do we remove it all? Do we just de-emphasize it entirely? What can we do to make sure that it stays something that is public and transparent, but also becomes a lot less important in the public imagination potentially?
Well, I was very keen to go on a public tour. And, if any of your listeners, Jewish listeners, have been thinking of going to Auschwitz, museum and haven't been there yet, I would say, for God's sake, go on a special Jewish tour. Don't do the public tour. But for my job, I wanted to do the public tour, and I thought it was appalling, really. I mean, the first tour guide we had, seemed in no way emotionally connected to her work. And I mean, I'd be fascinated to know more about what it's actually like to work there. You know, going through this every day, do you have to, is it like being a soldier? Do you have to become totally emotionally cauterized to get through the day? But she just seemed, you know, a little bit bored and dismissive. The people I was with were clearly enjoying it. You know, they'd heard that this is where hell was. And the second tour guide was rather better. He was very, very knowledgeable, very, very interested in history. But then towards the end of the tour, he told the group that the Sonderkommandos, who of course were the mostly Jewish workers who were kept alive temporarily to dispose of the bodies, had quite a looks life. And I just thought, oh, for God's sake, have you been there?
I have not. I did not go to March the Living. I feel like I've seen so many Holocaust museums and so many films and so many books and so many documentaries. It feels like if I went there, I would know exactly what I would be doing without having ever visited it. I'm not saying that I don't need to or that it's a suitable replacement, but I feel like it's so ever present that it's like I feel like almost I don't necessarily need to go right now.
I mean, I would never say to anyone you should go or you shouldn't go. I mean, in a minute, I'm possible to argue that nobody should go. I just wanted to know whether you'd seen it, because the thing I found most heartbreaking and awful is the Birkenau Memorial, this sort of disgusting Jenga type concrete edifice at the end of the Great Line. I mean, first of all, you'll see the famous guardhouse, which everyone seems to be obsessed with. And then there is two straight lines, and there's this railway line, and there's where they had the selections, and at the end, the two crematorias side by side, and in between them, it's got an awful symmetry. It seemed to me it's a Nazi structure. And they built this disgusting memorial in the mid-60s. It has no Jewish symbolism.
So this is something that I really, a line from your article that jumped out, but that I wanted to highlight in particular is where you wrote, I mostly think that if you don't know what a Jew is when you walk into Auschwitz-Birkenau, you still won't know it when you walk out. And so whatever else it is a memorial to nothing except logistics. So this is just making me think that there's a lot of discussion among Jews of sort of, and not just among Jews, about not having the Holocaust have too sort of parochial a message, and the importance of, you know, taking universal sort of human rights messaging from it. But what comes across in your piece is the way that to take Jews out of it, you know, its own problem. And two things come through in your piece. I'm trying to figure out how to best ask about this, because it's both an absence of Jews and this weird sort of Jewishness theme park element. And it's almost the theme park element that's more unnerving than the sort of forced universalism.
Well, you know, Auschwitz-Birkenau isn't a theme park. Krakow is a theme park. Krakow is the stop-off. You go to Krakow and then you get the bus to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and then you come back on the same day. That's what most people do. The locals don't like it. You know, they want people to stay in their medieval town. I stayed in the beautiful medieval town. I found Krakow absolutely extraordinary. Apparently after the war, obviously, like much of Poland, it was a bomb site. Then it was a sort of place where derelicts went. Of course, all the Jews had gone. And now it is a gentrified district full of bars and restaurants and hotels, and they're all Jewish themed, but there aren't any Jews. And there's a restaurant on the main square called the Ariel restaurant, and Ariel is written in sort of Hebrew style letters, and they have a Jewish band and they have Jewish food, and yet if you go in as I do and facetiously say shalom, it was like a scene from The Producers. They will stare at you like you are completely crazy. I mean, I suppose I thought in my crazy way, and I'm almost embarrassed to say this to you because you'll just think, you know, I'm supposed to be sort of a sophisticated writer, but really, why do I sound like an 11-year-old girl? But I thought when I went to Poland, I'd go, you know, we're back, and they'd give us a hug and say, it's so good to see you. It was not like that at all. I almost got the impression that when people went to Krakow for their Jewish experience, they were sort of not exactly pleased there weren't Jews there, but it's almost like I got the sense they didn't want Jews to insert themselves. You know, like when you go to a very expensive restaurant, you don't want to interact with any of the other diners. And
well, you tell that amazing story about the Shabbat services that where the Jews were kind of called out for being interlopers.
I spoke to some wonderful people who worked in Krakow, wonderful non-Jewish Poles, and one of them told me that they were organizing a Shabbat service, and of course loads of Israelis were coming along and they'd booked. Because, it's like a Jackie Mason trope, isn't it? Jews book. We want to make sure we'll be allowed in the building. And there were non-Jews who hadn't booked and they weren't being allowed in. And then the Israelis with their tickets came past and one guy completely freaked out and said, why aren't you letting me in? I mean, I'm paraphrasing now. I can't remember exactly what was said, but it was certainly something along the lines of, why are you letting those Jews in when, I've been in the queue for much longer? I have a right to be in that Shabbat service. And of course, the other thing that you find in Krakow is everywhere there are these little toy Jews. And they've usually got coins in their hands, and it's called the Lucky Jew. And I understand it's quite a recent invention. If you miss the 3.5 million Jews of Poland, you can buy a new one. And put it on your shelf. And that reminded me of one other thing I wanted to say to you about the Ariel Cafe in Kazimierz, with which I became completely obsessed, is I counted at least 20 anti-Semitic portraits on the walls of Jews, sort of with their coins and with their notes and with their gold. And this is a restaurant for people who think they like Jews, and then you're going through this sort of an anti-Semitic art gallery, and then suddenly there's a picture of a horse, and the horse looks like a Virgin Mary, and it's like you get the impression the artist really liked the horse, and it was just really extremely crazy and weird.
But it's not for Jews, right? This is for tourism. This is for people that, like I said, they feel like they have to do this as one of the other stops that they do when they go to Europe is go and do this. And like, I go to Old Montreal, and Old Montreal is filled with knickknacks that are stereotypes of the early French settlers. And
are they hateful stereotypes, though?
They are not. They are probably very inaccurate. The same way that I think that the lucky Jew is probably the person who's selling it is not even aware, right, that they are doing, perpetuating an anti-Semitic trope. I'm not defending this. I'm just trying to I'm really dismissive of it. It's like, yeah, whatever. Let those. It's indicative of something much, much larger and much more nefarious. But on the day-to-day level, like, okay, that's what they're tourists. They want to have a cafe. They want to sell. That to them, Judaism is just this thing that's a commodity that people are coming through. Well, you might as well sell something to them.
Well, I do have some good news for you, Avi, because I spoke to a couple of British tourists in Krakow and also Oswiecim, and they were desolate, and there was this woman from the north of England, quite a bit of money, I would imagine. She'd come out with her friends, her female friends, and they were going to have a lovely weekend away from their husbands. And they thought, oh, yeah, let's go to Krakow. And then they go to Kazimierz and they're wandering around. And they did have an emotional response to it. And they were sad.
Well, that's good.
And one woman said, well, it's so sad here. And I'm like, yes, it is. I suppose, is that good news?
No, I think it is good news. And I think that, some people are always going to be changed the same way that some Jews that visit Auschwitz are not changed, and that it's not going to affect everybody in the same sort of way. There is no stereotype in that way. I still am very much hung up on this, like, Jews who visit Auschwitz and what's the purpose of it. And it goes towards, again, back to our friend, the historian of genocide, Konstantin Gebert, who basically, says that you cannot fix this. What did he say? The real world is Kiev and Kabul, if I can quote from
the real world is not here. The
real world is Be'eri and Rafah.
And Be'eri.
We have failed to understand that a world within Auschwitz cannot be mended. The ambition of trying to make it good again is wrong, simply because a genocide leaves a hole in the heart of the world that cannot be filled. And what struck me is, I think that the Jews who visit Auschwitz haven't gotten that message. And the Jews that create memorials around the world and create Holocaust museums really think that what they're doing is to fix things, to make it better. And I don't think you can. And I think that that's a recipe for failure of all these museums. And that's why Auschwitz at some point is a failure as a memorial, because as much as it's going to create an emotional response in you, it's not, that gap is not bridgeable by saying, well, great, I'm going to go and do this and I'm going to go and do that and I'm going to go, whatever.
I mean, look, I went for this article, but that's not the real reason I went. I went to say the Kaddish for my Polish cousins, and I don't know if I will ever go back. I don't think there's any intellectual value in going. I don't think that people, non-Jewish people or non-Roma people, have a right to this graveyard to go and feel moved, to feel this, to feel that, whatever. Personally, I would lock the whole place and turn it back into a garden. And this obsession, you mentioned the Dara Horn book with people love dead Jews. They're obsessed with Jewish death, which insinuates a sort of obsession with Jewish criminality, because I think a lot of not very bright people, or not very educated people, of whom there are so many, would go to that and they would see, the Steven Spielberg inspired images in their heads. That's wrong. That's, again, treating the Holocaust as cinema. They will see the scope of the destruction and they might think, what the hell did the Jews do wrong, to deserve all this? I talk to a lot of educators and it's prosaic, but the sensible ones, the clever ones say to me, if you don't teach the whole of Jewish history, if you only teach the Holocaust, people will learn nothing because you don't know what is lost. And as you said about the Holocaust memorials.
Just to add even more to that, to Jews, if the only thing we teach Jews is the Holocaust, then you're losing it all out as well. We do make that mistake often. Of course I do. I sort of feel that as Jews, we can have a go at Holocaust memorials. But I also believe, I am not going to place, the 2,000-year-old burden of anti-Semitism on the shoulders of Jews. If somebody wants to found a museum or a library or write a book, they can do that. Of course it hasn't worked.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the whole left aspect of things. I just keep thinking about in terms of the absence of what is an authentically Jewish space and how basically nothing gets to kind of count as that. And I'm thinking just in terms of this whole notion that you see very much online, offline as well, that Israeli culture is all made up. It's all fake. It's all some sort of pantomime of something else, the like modern Hebrew that's all sort of like invented as opposed to other people's cultures that are, supposedly more natural or something like that. Right. And so then what's left? Like if Israel isn't authentic, if in Poland you can get at best a Jewishness themed thing, I feel like there's a sort of, if you're trying to understand, not either of you personally, who I'm sure understand it better than I do, but if one is trying to understand anti-Semitism and specifically the legacy of the Holocaust for Jews, I think some of it is just this kind of an absence of, like, you don't have the authentic spaces. There is no sort of thing you can point to of where you're from, in a way.
Well, we have the spaces we've been given. I see these days, and I don't want to generalize too much. I'm talking about the Jews that I know. I know the Jews I know are sort of liberal Zionists. They're not shouty crackers, greater Israelists. I don't hang out with people like that. But I see a community, that is grieving. And of course, we've made mistakes. And of course, the enormous and disgusting new Holocaust memorial that we're going to build by Parliament in the UK isn't going to do anything to change, to diminish anti-Semitism in this country. But I won't blame Jewish people for this. I think one of the themes of the current anti-Semitic outpouring is a refusal of people to take responsibility for themselves. And I think I'm paraphrasing a Jean-Paul Sartre quote here, when, the anti-Semite doesn't have to be serious, but the Jew must. I just think, as you know better than I do, we are a pluralistic community. We do all kinds of things and we think all kinds of things. I can't blame us for this.
Well, Tanya Gold, it's been a pleasure having you on. Please come back anytime. Thank you so much for sharing. The story is called My Auschwitz Vacation, I believe that's the title. It's in Harper's Magazine. Go check it out.
This is an audition to be a cantor.
But I don't want to be a cantor.
I wasn't raised with any religion. You're Jewish, though.
The heartbeat of community.
I welcomed Sam into my community by first taking his foreskin and next showing him the beautiful Twister bagel.
Culturally Jewish is the only podcast covering the weird, wide world of independent Canadian Jewish art.
Listen to Culturally Jewish at the cjn.ca/culture or wherever you get your podcasts.
On to the news of the week. This week, the pagers and walkie-talkies in Lebanon have been exploding.
So As I understand it, it is not all pagers and walkie-talkies of Lebanon, but this was a targeted Israeli attack on Hezbollah pagers. There were some people who were not in Hezbollah, including at least one child was killed also. So like there was this footage. What I immediately saw after this was just some footage of what looked like a fruit market, explosions in a fruit market. So the twist here is that normally you see Middle East explosions in a fruit market in Jewish news and you think, oh no, something has happened in Israel where a terrorist attack has happened. But then the twist here is that this is presented in Jewish media and in much of media as something different.
I don't know, people are trying to figure out why now, what's the purpose of this?
My first thought when I saw this was that is absurd that this has happened, but what is the point? And then I saw the next morning, the New York Times headline was something like, this happened, it's unclear what the point was. So it's fair to say it was a little bit, and is a little bit confusing what the point was. And we can talk about this, but some of it was clearly to do a precise attack, as precise as possible, I guess, on members of Hezbollah rather than, blowing up an apartment building in which 3 people are in Hezbollah and the rest are just ordinary people, women, children, whatever, going about their business. But also there's the highlighting of like membership, right? Because some people's pagers exploded who one maybe wouldn't expect. And also there's this humiliation angle that there's a device that somebody's keeping perhaps in an intimate area, like in their pants, and it explodes. And there is
the thing that I think about in terms of like all these people asking, well, what was the purpose of this and what's going on? And I think there's probably a lot of truth that the Israeli intelligence had an opportunity to do this, meaning that they had an opportunity to intercept a whole bunch of pagers going into Lebanon and tamper with them and be able to do this. So that's the first thing that I thought about. But the bigger question that made me realize was like, 20 years ago, if this had happened, nobody would have questioned the Israeli, defense and the Israeli Secret Service and the Mossad from being able to do this. They would have been like, there is probably a brilliant reason that we will understand in the coming days and weeks about how great this is. And I think that the intelligence failures of the Israeli security systems are being shown here in that people are second guessing them. People are wondering whether this is even valuable or worthwhile, or they're just trying to do stuff to be able to do stuff. And I think that shows how far the Israeli security apparatus have fallen in terms of the global consciousness and perception.
Right. I mean, I think it's a little late in the day after October 7th to think of Israel as so, like the Israeli intelligence specifically, as so ahead of things when clearly something didn't go right there. Here, my question was just whether, like, this is obviously attention getting, and I think the case can be made that as attacks go, it was not particularly unethical, given the targeted nature of it. Obviously, war is evil, you know what I mean? Like, it's never good, but like, you could say that this is certainly less bad than other things that parties in any war have done. However, what I was going to say is because of the humiliation aspect of it, because of the blowing up of a bunch of men's more sensitive areas potentially, I could see this really escalating and not looking so good for Israel.
Interesting. I hadn't thought about that angle.
So, from the humiliation of this.
From emasculating, Middle Eastern men.
Well, not just Middle Eastern men, but men in general. Yeah.
I hadn't thought about that, but that's a very, very good point. Almost immediately, the memes and the jokes have started, flying. I get WhatsApp messages all the time, which is for a lot of people, their social media. And on Facebook, I've seen a lot of like lines that people have been giving to me about this. I don't want to get into them. And the question that I have is, if we don't want people to laugh at our misfortune or to have glee at our misfortune, is it right, no matter how targeted a strike this is, no matter how tactical it was and how decidedly every attempt was made at not being evil in this case, should we still be laughing at this? Or is this something where we go and say, hey, if we really don't want this to be happening on the other side, where somebody goes and says, oh, Israelis died, they're my oppressors, I'm going to laugh, I'm going going to have fun with this, then we shouldn't be doing it on the other side either.
So 2 things on this. One is I don't think we can make an equivalence of something like October 7th and, an attack on a music festival with this type of attack, right? I think these are obviously very
that is
different
agreed, yes.
sorts of things.
Yeah.
But also, I would say, but more to the point, this question of should we be laughing? No, we shouldn't. Everybody should be good at all times. Nobody should ever laugh at something that's not, just some comedian like hopping around in a silly way and, or like a clown or, yeah, fine. Anytime anybody has died, even if there had been no bystanders killed, even if this had literally just been, enemy combatants, it's not funny. Nothing, it's serious, it's death. These are people's lives. Nobody should ever laugh at anything. I think it's asking a lot of humans, given human nature, for there not to be memes and laughter when at the nature of this attack, which was, I think, by intent, absurd. There's something absurd about the whole thing. It is absurd. Whether absurd and funny are the same thing, I mean, that's it's like philosophy of comedy, or I have no idea. I didn't see this and laugh. Like, my instinct wasn't to laugh, but it did seem absurd. There was something absurd about it, and I was thinking of it more along the lines of how absurd is it going to be if World War III has started from a bunch of pagers exploding, not that this would have really been what started it, but you know what I mean? Like, there's just, it is absurd, right? Is it not absurd?
Yes. Oh, 100%. What you're touching on, I think, which is really interesting, is the nature of our funny bone, our humor muscle in ourselves, and sometimes it's just really hard to turn it off. Our producers know how many jokes that I say that are not funny to the vast majority of people, but that are just really in the moment, and I'm like, yeah, I can laugh about anything. I can always find the humor in something, even if other people might not, but it's not always appropriate. And so thankfully my producers tend to cut them out. But I will accept that, it's important to recognize that sometimes funny is funny, no matter when and how hard it is to avoid that and say, no, we're better than that.
I mean, I think another angle that we need to remember is that if you're Israeli and this is an entity that has been trying to attack you for a year now, these rockets, maybe you're not being so, you don't have to be so high and mighty about it. You know what I mean? Like,
Perhaps,
I think there is a time in
yeah, like I said, yeah.
I don't know. To me, this seems like I'm going to go down on the side of generous to the people who laughed about this and not projecting onto them, you wanted a child dead. Like, clearly they didn't. Like, clearly that's not what's implied here. And I think that's an overly ungenerous interpretation of somebody who hears a bunch of terrorist pagers exploded and laughs, because that is funny. The full story is never funny in any human situation. There's always something upsetting, and here particularly upsetting.
Speaking of absurd Israeli intelligence, I'd like to move to the Jewish Chronicle. What can you tell us about the Jewish Chronicle and how absurd and fake what was going on there and why we should care about it?
So I wrote one article for the Jewish Chronicle in 2017, okay? And this is important because was it 2022? The Jewish Chronicle changed ownership and apparently direction. So I cannot speak to the Jewish Chronicle of today, except as a regular reader of it. The Jewish Chronicle is basically the CJN, but British, right? That's what it is. It's the main British Jewish legacy brand. Like virtually all legacy media has had different incarnations. It's also a place where a lot of mainstream journalists, people with a big platform in Britain generally, who happen to be Jewish, also write. So it's a place that's had, columns from, among others, like Tanya Gold, who still writes for them, Hadley Fraiman, who no longer writes for them. It's an important publication, but also it's the parochial press. The Jewish Chronicle had a regular freelancer providing the scoop on Israeli military matters, who turned out to be peddling the fake news, basically. It seems like.
This is a man named Elon Perry, claimed to have even been at the Entebbe raid as one of the commandos, and And it turns out that this individual was making everything up, and to the point where, you know, people were questioning the very validity of these stories even before he gets discovered. But he does get discovered, and there is a lot of egg on the face of the Jewish Chronicle. And a lot of people have resigned from writing their columns, as you mentioned. And then the question that's interesting also is that this is raising questions about the secretive ownership of the Jewish Chronicle. So
this I want to sort of zoom out a little bit, because there seems to be an internal debate in British media, some of which I've been following on X, formerly known as Twitter, where some are claiming that it's anti-Semitic to speak of the murky, sort of nebulous ownership of this publication, when others are pointing out that it literally is not known who owns the Jewish Chronicle, and that is something that many people, including many Jewish journalists, would like the answer to. So it seems like the anti-Semitism question here is interesting, because this tumult at, you know, a community publication, a parochial publication, has been of disproportionate interest to the mainstream media in the UK, with like mainstream big publications in the UK, you know, interested in this, right? So like the BBC Radio 4 interviewed Hadley Freeman about it. What do they care what's happening at some tiny publication for just a few people? You know, like, why is that of interest? And you could say, like, there is this disproportionate interest in Jewish matters that isn't necessarily itself anti-Semitism, but certainly, like, these things are all intertwined. That said, it isn't great to be publishing fake news, and there isn't any kind of, it's anti-Semitic to point out corruption or lies or whatever because you want to keep the dirty laundry secret. No, I mean, like, clearly this is a problem that they shouldn't have been running this.
At the immediate level, it's the fake news thing, right? An organization shouldn't be publishing fake news. When the New York Times fired a journalist for publishing fake news, right? That was news. It had nothing to do with, I was going to say it had nothing to do with Jews, but it did. But it had nothing to do with Judaism. It had nothing to do with Israel, but it was fake news. And they take these things seriously, and they fire an individual for doing that. People who publish books that turn out not to be true and that try to get republished as fiction. This is a problem. And you have to admit that this is not a memoir, this is fiction, whatever it might be. All of these stories are real and are important. Then the question becomes, is this malicious, right? Was this done because somebody wanted to get pro-Israel stories and to get more pro-Israel stories and to paint Israel in the best possible light? From what I understand, from what we understand, it probably wasn't the case. This was just them not necessarily checking the backgrounds of their writers well enough, which they should have 100%. So that's, there, and that's important to know. But I guess because the owner is so private and we don't know who this is, then we wouldn't
I would
be
not,
able to
I
go
would
and
not
say
that,
like, that's where people are making that conspiracy theory, I think, is to be able to say, well, if we don't know who this person is, maybe person is pulling strings from above and deciding, hey, let's put in as many possible pro-Israel stories and let's find people who are going to write these stories regardless of what it is. That's what happens when you are a secretive owner, that people can then project whatever fears, whatever issues onto this as you can.
I don't think we have any way to know either way on this, Avi. I don't.
No, we don't. I think you're right. That's the point. But
I would say that I think this is like a more general media story, which is that you get the people who are kind of writers and maybe not super business savvy who, have this product, the writing, the, media output, whatever, that in this day and age needs these other sources of funding. And often it is going to be some sort of billionaire swooping in and sort of funding something for a little while and then changing their mind about
look
it.
Look at the Washington Post. Jeff Bezos is propping that thing up. If the owner turned out to be a far right, like hardcore Zionist who actually was influencing at the highest levels the writing of some stories and saying you should hire this guy, then we would have reason to be able to point fingers. And that's when you don't know, that's when these conspiracy theories start popping up. And I don't believe these conspiracy theories. I do believe that it was a mistake at the editorial level. But what it's raising this question is what happens when you have a secretive owner? This is what happens. Okay, well, let's move on to Nachas Bregas. What's made us feel good or really pissed us off? Phoebe, do you have something for us?
I hope this doesn't seem too scraping the bottom of the barrel-ish, but I have to recommend owning and using a clothes iron. I got an iron and an ironing board for the first time in my life, and I don't know if I'm ever going to do it again, but I ironed a bunch of t-shirts. I ironed some of my kids' stuff. I just tried to figure this out. I had ironed before, like helping my mother to do so as a child. I'm sure maybe still owns an iron, but this isn't like something that was ever a big feature of my life in my teens or later. But I was like, you know what? A lot of my clothing looks like crap and should probably be ironed. I don't know if I'm going to do it again often, but it looks amazing. Avi, do you iron your clothing? I feel like you do.
Yes. I use an iron all the time. An iron and a steamer because different ones have different uses.
Okay. Avi, next time you're in Toronto, you're going to come over and show me what I'm doing wrong with the ironing.
Done. Deal.
So what have you got this week?
I have a really nice nachas, actually. In my research for the interview we had with Tanya Gold, I came across this really interesting little collective of artists from Poland, Jewish artists, and their website is Me Poland, right, which is, from Poland, right, in the Hebrew, mepoland.pl, MIPOLIN.pl. And one of the things that they make, I think this was the first thing, and they've since expanded into other pieces of Judaica, is they find the places in and around Poland where mezuzot used to be, and they are now traces of the mezuzah on the lintel of a given house, where you see that there's an indentation there, or that there was the two nails, and they will go and make impressions of it, and then turn that impression into a mezuzah itself, which you can buy. And they'll sell you the mezuzah with the address and the information about this house that clearly used to be a Jewish house and is no longer a Jewish house. So it's a way of taking a trace of the past and bringing it into your home, into the present. And I thought it's a really nice piece of Judaica. It's a nice innovative way of honoring the past and doing something in a modern way. So go check them out. Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for the week ending September 21st, Shabbat Parashat Ki Tavo. The show is produced by Michael Fraiman and edited by Zach Kauffman. The executive producer for CJN Podcasts is Michael Fraiman. Our music is by So-Called. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. You can listen to all our past episodes on our page at thecjn.ca/bonjour, and you can subscribe to the podcast and automatically receive all episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We would love it if you told a friend about Bonjour Chai. It is one of the best ways we get new listeners. And as always, you can email us with comments at bonjour@thecjn.ca.